The last echo of a plasma burst faded into the violet haze of the Opaline Nebula, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the vacuum of space itself. High above the jagged remains of a destroyed cruiser, the bastion of Helios hung like a jagged diamond against the darkness. Its hangar bays remained open, glowing with a soft amber light that beckoned the survivors home. Inside the cockpit of the freighter officially designated as Logistic Unit 42, but affectionately known by its crew as the Rusty Snail, Kaelen Vance was having a mild heart attack. His hands, gloved in grease-stained synthetic leather, white-knuckled the flight yoke as he guided the bulky rectangular vessel through the debris field. The Snail was a glorified shipping container with thrusters slapped onto its sides, a ship that had no business being within 50 kilometers of an active combat zone. "Easy, girl," Kaelen whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't kick the reactor now. We've got 43 very grumpy, very bleeding soldiers in the back who would appreciate not being vaporized by a stray piece of scrap metal." The ship groaned, a deep metallic protest that vibrated through Kaelen's seat. Beside him, the navigation console flickered with a rhythmic, annoying red light. The onboard computer, which possessed a personality Kaelen suspected was programmed by a depressed philosopher, spoke up in a dry, synthetic tone. "Proximity alert," the computer stated. "There are approximately 7,000 fragments of shrapnel currently sharing our flight path. Statistically, we are already dead. I suggest we stop and contemplate our existence." "Shut it, Barnaby," Kaelen snapped, swerving the Snail to avoid a charred piece of a Void Strider scout ship. "I don't pay you for statistics. I pay you to— Wait, I don't pay you at all. Just keep the shields at 10%. "Shields are currently at 3%, Kaelen," Barnaby corrected. "They are essentially a polite suggestion for the enemy not to shoot us." Kaelen wiped sweat from his forehead. He was not a warrior. He was a 32-year-old man who preferred lukewarm coffee and the quiet hum of a cargo registry office. But when the distress signal had flared across the system, indicating a medical outpost had been overrun, Kaelen had been the only one close enough with enough floor space to haul the survivors out. The flight back had been a nightmare. Every time a Void Strider interceptor roared past, Kaelen had instinctively closed his eyes and prayed to whatever deity looked after mediocre pilots. In a moment of sheer, unadulterated panic during the hottest part of the dogfight, he had reached for the emergency alert button and accidentally smashed his elbow into the entertainment console instead. For 20 minutes, while the elite pilots of the Onyx Vanguard were performing death-defying maneuvers and trading fire with the alien swarm, the entire local communication frequency, the very channel used for tactical coordination, had been flooded with the soft, tinkling bells and synthesized pan flutes of deep space meditation. Volume 7. "I'm never going to live this down," Kaelen muttered, as the glowing entrance of the Helios hangar grew larger in his viewport. "They're going to court-martial me for crimes against musical taste." He adjusted the thrusters, feeling the delicate shuddering weight of the ship as it entered the pressurized landing envelope. The gravity stabilizers kicked in, pulling the Snail down toward the magnetic landing grid. With a final, agonizing hiss of steam, the ship settled into its berth. Kaelen sat in silence for a long minute, listening to the cooling metal ping and pop. He exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for 3 hours. He was alive. The fragile vegetables and his private nickname for his passengers to keep from crying were alive. "Mission successful," Barnaby announced. "Despite your best efforts to fly like a drunken asteroid, we have arrived. Also, I should inform you that the meditation music is still broadcasting to the entire deck." Kaelen jumped, frantically stabbing at the console until the soft flute melody cut off abruptly. He slumped back, rubbing his face. "Great. Just perfect." He stood up, his legs feeling like overcooked noodles, and grabbed his flight jacket. When he opened the airlock, the noise of the hangar hit him like a physical blow. It was a symphony of chaos, the roar of welding torches, the rhythmic clanging of hammers against hull plating, and the shouting of deck officers. Medical teams were already swarming the Snail's cargo ramp, hauling out stretchers. Kaelen watched them, leaning against the cold metal of his ship. He saw a young soldier, barely 20 years old, grip the hand of a medic and point back at the ship. Kaelen couldn't hear the words, but he saw the soldier's lips move. "He came back for us." A lump formed in Kaelen's throat. He turned away, trying to look busy with a data pad he hadn't even turned on. He just wanted to disappear. He wanted to go to his bunk, eat a synthetic protein bar, and sleep for a century. "Hey, you, Dust Eater!" Kaelen froze. A group of 3 fighter pilots, still clad in their sleek, pressurized onyx suits, were walking toward him. They looked like gods of the sky, tall, fit, and radiating an aura of expensive arrogance. "Me?" Kaelen asked, pointing a thumb at his chest. The lead pilot, a man with a jawline that could cut glass, grinned. "You're the guy in the flying brick, right? The one who gave us the soundtrack for the battle?" Kaelen felt his ears turn bright red. "It was a technical glitch. I was trying to hit the distress flare." "Fro." The pilots laughed, but it wasn't the cruel laughter he expected. "Kid, I've never seen a freighter move like that," the pilot said, clapping Kaelen on the shoulder with enough force to make his teeth rattle. "You flew straight through a crossfire to pick up those grunts. And the music? I actually shot better listening to those flutes. Made the killing feel peaceful." "I'm glad I could provide a soothing atmosphere for your violence," Kaelen muttered. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," another pilot said. "Most logistics guys bug out the moment they see a vape trail. You stayed until the last stretcher was in. Respect." They moved on, leaving Kaelen standing there in a state of mild shock. Respect? From the Onyx Vanguard? It was like being complimented by a shark for having a nice swimsuit. He shook his head and began walking toward the hangar exit. He needed to get clear before anyone else noticed him. But as he neared the heavy blast doors, the atmosphere in the hangar shifted. The noise didn't stop, but it changed in pitch. The shouting became whispers. The clanging died down to a dull thud. A new squadron was coming in. Kaelen stopped and looked back. 5 black and gold interceptors glided into the hangar with a precision that was almost supernatural. These weren't standard ships. They were Athelian-modified wraiths. They didn't roar. They hummed with a low-frequency vibration that made Kaelen's skin tingle. The lead ship touched down in the center of the elite docking zone. The canopy slid back with a whisper of escaping gas. A figure climbed out, moving with a fluid, liquid grace that made the human pilots look like clumsy toddlers. It was her, Vexra Valtaris. Kaelen had seen her on the news feeds, of course. Everyone in the Union had. She was the Opaline Oracle, the pilot who had single-handedly held off a swarm hive ship for 12 minutes. Up close, even from 50 meters away, she was breathtaking. Her skin was the color of a pale morning sky, and her hair was a cascade of shimmering silver that seemed to catch the light even in the dim hangar. But it was her ears that marked her, long, elegant, and slightly pointed, currently twitching as they sampled the ambient, psychic noise of the room. She jumped from the wing of her ship, landing soundlessly. A crowd of commanders and high-ranking officers immediately converged on her, eager to hear her report, to be seen in her presence, or perhaps just to breathe the same air as a living legend. Kaelen watched for a moment, fascinated. She looked entirely bored, her eyes iridescent and shifting between shades of teal and gold, scanned the room with a detached curiosity. She nodded politely to a general, ignored a captain's outstretched hand, and kept walking. Time to go, Kaelen thought. This is way too much high-status energy for one room. He turned and hurried toward the exit, his boots echoing on the metal floor. He was almost at the door when a voice, clear and resonant, like the striking of a crystal bell, rang out across the hangar. The pilot of the transport vessel. Kaelen kept walking. There are dozens of transports. She means someone else, someone important. The pilot of the rusty snail. Kaelen stopped as if he had hit an invisible wall. He slowly turned around. The entire hangar had gone silent. Hundreds of eyes were now fixed on him, the grease-stained, slightly too thin logistics pilot in a tattered jacket. Vexra Valtaris was standing 20 meters away. She had walked away from the generals. She had walked away from the heroes. She was looking directly at him. Kaelen swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am? I mean, Colonel? Your Highness?" She tilted her head, her long ears angling forward. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "The music," she said, her voice carrying easily in the silence. "Was it your choice?" Kaelen felt the blood drain from his face. "It was a mistake, ma'am." My elbow, it's very clumsy. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. The crowd parted for her like water before a prow. I see. And the decision to enter the sector without an escort? Was your elbow responsible for that as well? No, Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a whisper. That was just poor life choices. Vexra stopped 3 steps away from him. Close up, she smelled like ozone and something sweet, like rain on a hot desert. She studied him with an intensity that made Kaelen feel like he was being scanned by a high-powered laser. You were afraid, she stated. It wasn't a question. I was terrifyingly close to wetting my flight suit, yes, Kaelen admitted honestly. A soft ripple of laughter went through the hangar. Vexra, however, did not laugh. Her expression remained thoughtful. She reached out, her slender, blue-tinted fingers hovering just inches from the cargo registry pad Kaelen was holding. Everyone in this room fights for glory, for duty, or for the thrill of the hunt, she said, her voice dropping so only he could hear it. But you were just trying to get your cargo home, weren't you? The cargo was people, ma'am, Kaelen said, his brow furrowing. You don't leave people behind. It's bad for the paperwork. Vexra's eyes brightened, the teal shifting into a warm gold. She lowered her hand. Interesting. She turned to the stunned crowd of officers. I will be taking my post-flight meal in the general mess hall today, she announced to the room. Then she looked back at Kaelen. I hope the food in the common sector is better than the music. Before Kaelen could respond, she turned and walked away, her silver hair swaying behind her. Kaelen stood frozen. Barnaby's voice chimed in his ear through his headset. Kaelen, I believe your social standing just experienced a vertical leap of approximately 500%. Also, you are holding the data pad upside down. Kaelen looked at the pad, then at the retreating back of the most famous woman in the galaxy. Barnaby? Yes, Kaelen? I think I'm in a lot of trouble. By the following morning, the trouble Kaelen had anticipated had evolved into a full-scale social catastrophe. He had tried to stay in his bunk. He really had. He'd spent 4 hours staring at the bottom of the bunk above him, hoping that perhaps the bastion of Helios would suffer a minor, non-lethal hull breach that would necessitate everyone staying in their rooms for a week. No such luck. Hunger eventually won. It always did. As Kaelen walked down the corridor toward the Deck 12 cafeteria, he noticed a subtle change in the environment. Usually a logistics pilot was invisible, part of the background machinery, like a ventilation fan or a floor cleaning drone. Today, people were stepping aside. That's him, a technician whispered as Kaelen passed. The flute guy? Another asked. No, the one Val Terrace talked to. She spent 3 minutes with him. I timed it. Kaelen pulled his collar up and stared at his boots. He reached the cafeteria, a vast utilitarian space filled with the smell of recycled air and burnt synthetic protein. He grabbed a tray and slid it along the metal rail. Nutritional cube, gray, the food dispenser chirped. Can I get the brown one today? Kaelen asked hopefully. It's my birthday. Nutritional cube gray is the only authorized selection for logistics personnel, the machine replied with a cold, mechanical lack of empathy. Happy birthday, Kaelen. Your heart health is within acceptable parameters. Kaelen sighed and took his gray cube. He looked around for a quiet corner, somewhere tucked behind a support pillar or near a trash incinerator. He found a spot and sat down, carefully poking the cube with a plastic fork. It had the consistency of a damp eraser. Is this seat taken? Kaelen didn't look up. Yes, by the ghost of my social life. Please go away. I was not aware that ghosts required physical seating, the voice replied. Kaelen's fork slipped, skidding across the tray. He looked up. Vexra Valtaris was standing there, holding a tray that contained a significantly more appetizing meal, something that looked like actual fruit and a glass of amber-colored nectar. The entire cafeteria went dead silent. The sound of 300 people holding their breath was surprisingly loud. Ma'am, Kaelen said, half rising from his chair, You can't sit here. Vexra tilted her head, her wing-like ears twitching. Is there a biological hazard I was not informed of? Is the gray cube contagious? No, it's just... Kaelen gestured wildly at the room. Look at them. They're staring. You're a colonel. You're an Athelian ace. I'm a guy who once accidentally deleted the entire inventory of the ship's toilet paper. Vexra sat down across from him, her movements effortless. She took a sip of her nectar, her eyes never leaving his. I am aware of your inventory mishap, Kaelen Vance. I read your file last night. Kaelen groaned and put his head in his hands. Of course you did. Was the part about the fuel cart incident in there too? The one where you claimed the cart was parked aggressively? Vexra's iridescent eyes shimmered with amusement. Yes, it was quite a creative defense. I stand by it, Kaelen muttered through his fingers. He looked up, his expression turning serious. Why are you doing this? If this is some kind of bet between you and the other pilots, I should tell you I don't have any money to lose. Vexra set her glass down. The humor faded from her face, replaced by a look of quiet, piercing sincerity. In my culture, we do not make bets with people's lives. We value the korta, the resonance of a person's spirit when the noise of the world is stripped away. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a level that made the nearby eavesdroppers lean in so far they nearly fell off their benches. Yesterday, in the hangar, I felt your resonance. It was not the loud, jagged vibration of a man seeking to be a hero. It was steady, humble. It felt like home. Kaelen stared at her. He felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest, one that had nothing to do with the mediocre cafeteria heating. I'm just a pilot, Vexra. I fly boxes from point A to point B. And when point B was surrounded by fire, you did not turn back, she countered. I have met thousands of warriors, Kaelen. They are all the same. They are all trying to prove they are the biggest star in the sky. But stars are cold. They are distant. She reached across the table. For a second, Kaelen thought she was going to touch his hand, but she simply pointed at his tray. You are more like a planet. You have soil. You have roots. And apparently, you have very bad taste in music. Kaelen laughed, a genuine sound that broke the tension. Hey, Volume 7 is a classic. It's supposed to help with stress. It nearly caused me to fly into a moon out of sheer confusion, Vexra said, her smile widening. It was a beautiful smile, one that made her look less like a goddess and more like a person. Hey, Vance! The moment was shattered by a loud, boisterous voice. A group of 3 Onyx pilots, led by the jawline man from the day before, approached the table. They looked from Kaelen to Vexra, their expressions a mix of confusion and forced camaraderie. Colonel, the leader said, snapping a crisp salute, we were just about to head to the simulation labs for some high-G drills. We'd be honored if you joined us. We've got a seat open in the Alpha Lead bracket. Vexra didn't even turn her head. She continued to look at Kaelen. I have already completed my flight hours for the day, Captain. I am currently engaged in a much more interesting conversation. The captain's smile faltered. He looked at Kaelen, his eyes narrowing. Conversation with the freighter guy? His name is Kaelen, Vexra said, her tone sharpening just a fraction. And yes, we are discussing the tactical deployment of meditative flutes. The pilots exchanged glances. Right. Well, if you change your mind... They retreated, their footsteps heavy and awkward. Kaelen watched them go, feeling a cold pit of dread in his stomach. You just insulted the golden boy of the Onyx Vanguard. He's going to make my life a living hell. Let him try, Vexra said calmly. He is a glint, all shine and no substance. He wouldn't last 5 minutes in a debris field without his targeting computer. I wouldn't last 5 minutes either, Kaelen whispered fiercely. That's the point. I'm a dust eater. I'm supposed to be at the bottom of the food chain. Vexra leaned back, her long ears twitching with what Kaelen was beginning to recognize as amusement. You are very persistent in your desire to be unimportant. It is almost a talent. It's a survival strategy, Kaelen corrected. If nobody notices you, nobody shoots at you. And yet, I noticed you, she said softly. The cafeteria was beginning to buzz again. The shock had worn off, replaced by a feverish wave of gossip. People were taking pictures with their data pads. A small group of mechanics was already running a betting pool on how long Kaelen would survive a date with an Athelian. This is going to ruin everything, Kaelen said, looking at his gray cube. My quiet life, my ability to nap in the cargo bay, all gone. Perhaps, Vexra said, standing up. But look on the bright side, Kaelen. What's the bright side? You no longer have to eat the gray cube alone. She picked up her tray and began to walk away, then stopped and looked back over her shoulder. There is a supply run to the research outpost on Velanis Prime tomorrow morning. I have requested to fly escort. Kaelen blinked. In a Wraith Interceptor? For a cargo ship? No, Vexra said, her teal eyes glowing with a mischievous light. I have requested to fly as your co-pilot. On the Rusty Snail. Kaelen's jaw dropped. You want to fly the Snail? It's a flying box. It doesn't have Echo Link. It doesn't even have a cup holder that works. Then you will have to show me how a real pilot handles a ship without all the shiny toys, she said. I will see you at 0600 hours, Kaelen. Do not be late. And please leave Volume 7 at home. She walked out of the cafeteria, leaving a trail of stunned silence in her wake. Kaelen sat there for a long time, staring at his empty tray. Finally, he looked at the ceiling. Barnaby, are you recording this? Yes, Kaelen, the computer's voice whispered in his ear. I have also updated your life expectancy. It has dropped significantly, but your coolness factor has increased by a margin I didn't think was mathematically possible. Shut up, Barnaby, Kaelen said, but he couldn't help the small, terrified, and slightly excited smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. The rumors were going to be legendary. The morning air inside the bastion of Helios smelled of ozone and the faint lingering scent of burnt synthetic rubber. It was a smell Kaelen Vance had grown to associate with impending doom, or at the very least a very long day of explaining things he did not fully understand. He walked through the secondary maintenance corridors of Deck 14, aiming to avoid the main thoroughfares where the gossip was currently traveling at speeds that would make a warp drive look like a tricycle. He clutched his datapad to his chest like a shield. Every few meters he encountered another soul. A group of deckhands stopped their welding to watch him pass. A pair of navigation officers whispered behind their hands. Kaelen felt like a rare biological specimen that had accidentally escaped its containment unit. He kept his head down, focusing on the scuff marks on his boots. He had owned these boots for 6 years, and they had seen more cargo bays than a customs inspector. They were reliable. They did not ask for his autograph. They did not care if an alien ace pilot thought his soul resonated with the frequency of a home hearth. Barnaby flickered to life in his earbud, his synthetic voice sounding particularly smug. I should inform you, Kaelen, that the betting pool in the engineering bay has reached 12,000 credits. The current odds are 3-1 that you will accidentally eject the colonel into a vacuum within the first 20 minutes of the flight. Kaelen gritted his teeth as he turned a corner. Thank you, Barnaby. Your faith in my mechanical aptitude is truly heartening. Is there any way we can rig the internal sensors to stop people from tracking my every move? The computer paused for a second as if considering the request. Technically, yes. Practically, no. You are currently the most interesting thing on this station that is not a smoking wreckage. Even the Admiral has asked for a copy of your flight log from yesterday. Apparently, he wants to know if the flute music was a psychological warfare tactic he should incorporate into the standard training manual. Kaelen groaned aloud. I hate this. I hate every single bit of this. I just want to haul my crates of medical supplies and go back to my bunk to read my technical manuals in peace. Why did she have to pick me? There are thousands of pilots here. Half of them would sell their own mothers for a chance to sit in a cockpit with her. She said you have soil, Kaelen, Barnaby reminded him. Perhaps she is looking for someone to help her start a garden. Kaelen reached the heavy blast doors of Hangar Bay 17. This was the quiet end of the station where the older ships were kept. The air here was colder and the lights flickered with a rhythmic instability that suggested the power grid was held together by hope and several rolls of industrial adhesive. The Rusty Snail sat in its cradle, looking more like a giant bruised metal grape than a spacefaring vessel. Its hull was a patchwork of different shades of gray and brown, the result of a dozen different repairs using whatever plating was available at the time. As Kaelen approached his ship, he saw that he was not alone. Standing near the landing struts was a group of 4 men wearing the black and gold flight suits of the Onyx Vanguard. In the center was Captain Jackson, the man with the jawline that Kaelen was certain had been engineered for maximum arrogance. Jackson was leaning against a stack of cargo crates, looking at the snail with an expression of pure disgust. "Look at this piece of junk," Jackson said, his voice echoing in the hollow space of the hangar. "I have seen better-looking scrap in a junkyard on Mars. And this is what the Colonel wants to fly in? A literal trash can with engines? One of the other pilots laughed. Maybe she wants to see how the other half lives Jackson. You know charity work. She spends all her time in a high-tech Wraith, so she wants to slum it with the logistics grunts for a day. Kaelen stopped a few meters away. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but he felt a strange cold anger rising in his throat. He had spent years maintaining the snail. He knew every creak, every groan, and every personality quirk of the old ship. She was slow and she was ugly, but she had never let him down. "Excuse me," Kaelen said, his voice surprisingly steady. "You are blocking the access ramp. I have a mission to prep and I am already behind schedule." Jackson turned his head slowly, his eyes scanning Kaelen from head to toe. "Ah, the hero of the hour. The man with the flutes. Tell me, Vance, how much did you pay the Colonel to pretend she likes you? Or did you just catch her at a moment of extreme battlefield fatigue?" Kaelen stepped forward. "I did not pay her anything, Captain. And as far as I can tell, she does not need me to defend her. She seems perfectly capable of making her own decisions. Now, if you do not mind, I have work to do." Jackson did not move. He stepped closer into Kaelen's personal space. He was a head taller and significantly broader. "Listen to me, you little grease monkey. Vexra is a symbol of this fleet. She is the best we have. Seeing her associated with a bottom feeder like you makes us all look bad. It makes the Vanguard look like a joke. You think because you picked up some wounded soldiers, you are one of us? You are nothing but a truck driver who got lucky." Kaelen looked up at him. "I never claimed to be one of you, Captain. I do not want to be one of you. I do not care about glory, and I certainly do not care about your symbols. I care about the people in the back of my ship. And right now, the only thing making the Vanguard look like a joke is your behavior." Jackson's face flushed a deep red. He reached out and grabbed the front of Kaelen's jacket, lifting him slightly off his feet. "You think you are clever, don't you? You think you are protected because the Colonel took a shine to you? Out here in the dark, things happen, Vance. Ships malfunction. Navigational errors occur. It would be a shame if that rusted bucket of yours suffered a catastrophic hull failure during your little excursion." Kaelen felt a surge of genuine fear, but he did not look away. "If you are going to threaten me, Captain, at least have the courage to do it when there are no security cameras watching. Or does the Vanguard only fight people who do not have weapons?" Jackson raised his fist, his knuckles whitening. Kaelen braced for the impact, closing his eyes. He waited for the pain, for the sound of his own nose breaking. It never came. "Is there a problem here, Captain Jackson?" The voice was quiet, but it had the weight of a falling mountain. Kaelen opened his eyes. Vexra Valtaris was standing at the edge of the hangar bay. She was not wearing her flight armor today. Instead, she wore a simple dark blue duty uniform that hugged her slender frame. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and her iridescent eyes were glowing with a cold teal light that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. Jackson dropped Kaelen abruptly. He straightened his jacket and snapped a salute, his face pale. "Colonel, we were just welcoming Pilot Vance to the active mission roster. We were discussing the technical specifications of his vessel." Vexra walked forward, her steps silent on the deck plating. She did not look at Jackson. She looked at Kaelen, checking for injuries with a quick clinical glance. Then she turned her gaze back to the Onyx pilots. "I was under the impression that the Vanguard was currently assigned to the long-range patrol of the Inner Nebula," she said. "I do not recall seeing orders for you to be in Hangar 17, unless, of course, you have been reassigned to cargo loading. I am sure the logistics department could use the extra muscle." Jackson swallowed hard. "No, Colonel. We were just leaving." "See that you do," Vexra said. "And Captain, if I hear of any navigational errors involving Pilot Vance's ship, I will personally oversee your next flight evaluation. I believe the Athelian standard for high-speed maneuvering is significantly more rigorous than what you are used to. I would hate to see you fail." Jackson gave a stiff nod, his eyes burning with resentment. "Understood, Colonel. Let's move out. Let's move." The pilot scurried away, disappearing into the corridor. Kaelen let out a long, shaky breath. He leaned against a cargo crate, his knees trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. "I think he was actually going to hit me." Vex returned to him, the cold light in her eyes softening. "He is a child who has been given too many toys," she said. He understands strength, but he does not understand power. Are you all right, Kaelen? Kaelen nodded, wiping a smudge of grease from his cheek. I am fine. Just another day in the life of a social pariah. Why are you here so early? We weren't supposed to depart for another 2 hours. I found the atmosphere in the officers' lounge to be stifling, Vexra replied. She walked toward the snail, looking up at the patched hull. Everyone wanted to talk about the battle. Everyone wanted to hear about how many Void Striders I destroyed. I find I am no longer interested in counting the dead. I would rather be somewhere quiet. She ran her hand along the side of the ship, her fingers tracing a long, jagged scar in the metal. This ship has seen a lot of history, she remarked. Kaelen smiled despite himself. That scar is from a mining station in the belt. A crane malfunctioned and dropped a 2-ton crate of ore on us. We almost lost the entire portside thruster assembly. I had to rig a manual bypass using 300 meters of copper wiring and a lot of prayer. Vexra looked at him, her ears twitching with curiosity. Manual bypass? Without a diagnostic AI? Kaelen shrugged. Barnaby was offline at the time. He had a virus that made him think he was a toaster. I had to do it by hand. It wasn't pretty, but it held long enough to get us back to a repair dock. Vexra nodded, her expression unreadable. I have never flown a ship that required prayer to stay in the air, she said. It will be a new experience for me. Kaelen walked toward the access ramp and punched in the code. The door groaned and hissed as it lowered, revealing the cluttered, dimly lit interior of the snail. The air smelled of old coffee machine oil and a hint of something that Kaelen hoped was cinnamon, but was probably just a leaking coolant valve. Welcome to the bridge, he said, gesturing inside. Watch your head on the overhead pipes. The gravity stabilizers have a habit of fluctuating when you step over the threshold. Vexra stepped inside, her eyes taking in everything. The stacks of spare parts tied down with bungee cords, the flickering monitors, the pilot's seat that had been repaired with duct tape. She didn't look disgusted like Jackson had. She looked fascinated. She reached out and touched a small bobblehead figure of a prehistoric Earth creature that was glued to the dashboard. What is this? She asked. That is a Stegosaurus, Kaelen said. He is my co-pilot. He doesn't say much, but he is very good at keeping me calm during atmospheric re-entry. Vexra smiled, a small, genuine thing that made Kaelen's heart skip a beat. I think I am going to like this ship, Kaelen Vance. It has a soul. Kaelen climbed into the pilot's seat and began flipping switches. Barnaby, bring the reactor to 60%. Initialize the life support and check the seals on the cargo bay. We have a long flight ahead of us. Understood, Kaelen, Barnaby replied. The reactor is currently grumbling, but it is functional. Life support is at 94%. The air might be a bit thin in the sleeping quarters, but as long as you do not breathe too deeply, you should be fine. Vexra sat in the co-pilot's seat, her long legs tucked neatly into the cramped space. She looked at the manual controls, her fingers hovering over the levers. Show me how it works, she said. No echo link, no psychic interface, just the machine and the man. Kaelen felt a surge of pride. He took the controls, feeling the familiar vibration of the engines beneath his feet. Hold on, Colonel, he said. The snail doesn't go fast, but she is very determined. As the ship lifted off the landing grid and drifted out of the hangar bay, Kaelen looked out the viewport at the vast expanse of the Opaline Nebula. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a freighter pilot trying to hide from the world. He felt like someone with a story to tell. And for some reason, the most famous pilot in the galaxy was sitting right beside him, waiting to hear it. The transition from the frantic energy of the bastion of Helios to the deep silence of open space was always Kaelen's favorite part of a journey. Once the docking clamps released and the ship moved beyond the station's immediate gravity well, the world became a vast canvas of velvet black and shimmering dust. The Opaline Nebula surrounded them like a dream, its gas clouds swirling in shades of turquoise, amethyst, and gold. The snail chugged along its engines, making a rhythmic clumping sound that Kaelen found soothing, but Vexra seemed to find concerning. Is that noise normal? She asked, her ears angled sharply toward the rear of the ship. It sounds as though a large metal object is being repeatedly struck by a smaller metal object. Kaelen didn't even look away from the navigation screen. That's just the number 3 fuel pump. It has a bit of a stutter. I've tried to fix it, but every time I tighten the bolts, the ship starts to smell like burning hair. I decided the noise was the lesser of two evils. Vexra leaned back in her seat, her eyes scanning the simplified HUD. We are currently traveling at 6% of the speed of light. In my Wraith, I would be across this sector in 15 minutes. In this ship, it will take us 4 hours. Kaelen glanced at her. If you are in a rush, Colonel, I can try to bypass the safety limiters on the thrusters. We might gain another 2%, but the vibration will probably shake your teeth loose. No, she said quietly. I am not in a rush. I was just observing. It is strange. In a combat ship, space is an obstacle. It is something you move through as quickly as possible to reach a target. You are always looking for the next threat, the next maneuver, the next kill. You never really look at the stars. She turned her gaze toward the viewport, watching a cluster of distant suns twinkle in the darkness. Out here, it feels different. It feels like we are actually part of the void rather than just fighting against it. Kaelen nodded. That's why I like the slow runs. You get to see things the fighters miss. Did you see that shimmer over there? Near the edge of the Thorn Ridge. That's an ion storm brewing. It looks beautiful from this distance, but if you fly into it without heavy shielding, it will strip the paint right off your hull. Vexra watched the shimmering light, her expression pensive. You see the danger, but you still find it beautiful. That is a rare perspective, Kaelen. Most people in the Union only see the resources we can extract, or the enemies we can hide from. They flew in silence for a while, the only sound the steady thrum of the snail and the occasional chirp from the navigation console. Kaelen found himself stealing glances at Vexra. In the soft glow of the bridge lights, her skin looked like polished marble, and her silver hair seemed to hold a light of its own. She looked peaceful, but there was an underlying tension in her shoulders, a weariness that went deeper than just a long day of combat. Why did you join the fleet? Kaelen asked, his voice low. Someone with your abilities. You could have done anything. You could have been an artist, a scientist, a diplomat. Why choose to spend your life in a cockpit killing things? Vexra's ears twitched, a sign that she was considering her answer carefully. My people, the Athelians, have a long history of being useful, she said finally. When we first made contact with humanity, we were seen as a curiosity. Then when the Void Striders appeared, we were seen as a weapon. My father was a pilot. My grandfather was a pilot. It was expected. She looked at her hands, her fingers tracing the fine lines of her palms. I have the echo link. I can hear the ship. I can feel the movement of every particle in the vacuum. To not use that gift during a war would be considered a betrayal of my race. But sometimes I wonder if the gift is actually a curse. When I am in the Wraith, I am not Vexra. I am a killing machine. I feel the death of every enemy I strike. I feel the fear of every pilot I chase. It is a lot to carry. Kaelen felt a pang of sympathy. He thought about his own past, about the days he spent in the academy, trying to prove he was tough enough to be a fighter pilot. I was kicked out of the flight program because of that, he said. Vexra looked at him surprised. You were in the academy? Kaelen nodded. For 2 years. I had the highest scores in my class for technical theory and navigation. But when it came to the combat simulations, I couldn't do it. Every time I had a lock on a target, my heart would start to race. I would think about the person on the other side. Do they have a family? Do they like music? Do they have a dog waiting for them back home? My instructor told me I was too soft. He said I was a liability to the fleet. He gave a bitter laugh. So they stuck me in logistics. They told me that if I couldn't kill for the Union, I could at least carry the gear for the people who could. At first, I hated it. I felt like a failure. But then I realized that I liked being the guy who brings the supplies. I like being the guy who rescues the people who didn't make it. It's not glorious, but at least I can sleep at night. Vexra leaned closer, her iridescent eyes searching his face. Your instructor was wrong, Kaelen. You are not soft. You are compassionate. In a galaxy filled with people trying to be iron, you are one of the few who has stayed flesh. That is not a liability, it is a miracle. Kaelen felt his face flush. He looked back at his screens, trying to hide his embarrassment. I don't know about that. I think I'm just a guy who is very afraid of dying. Courage is not the absence of fear, she said, echoing his own thoughts from earlier. It is doing what is right, even when your soul is screaming for you to run. Yesterday, you flew into a storm of plasma fire to save people you didn't even know. That is more courage than I have seen in 100 medals-decked heroes. Suddenly, a sharp alarm sounded from the console. A yellow light began to pulse on the long-range sensor array. Barnaby report, Kaelen said, his hands moving instinctively to the controls. I am detecting a distress signal, Kaelen, the computer replied. Its voice was no longer smug. It was flat and urgent. It is a union frequency, but it is fragmented. Originating from Sector 7G inside the Thorn Ridge. The Thorn Ridge, Kaelen frowned. That's a graveyard of jagged asteroids and volatile gas. Nobody goes in there unless they are looking for trouble or they are desperately lost. Vexra stood up, her military instincts taking over. Can you pinpoint the source? The signal is coming from a small scout vessel, Barnaby said. Based on the telemetry, it has suffered significant hull damage. Life support is failing. Estimated time until total system collapse is 40 minutes. Kaelen looked at the map. The ridge was 20 degrees off their current course. If they went there, they would be late for their delivery. The command deck would have his head, but he could hear the faint, rhythmic pulse of the distress beacon through the speakers. It sounded like a heartbeat. We have to go, he said. Are you sure? Vexra asked, her eyes fixed on his. Your ship is not built for asteroid navigation, and we have no weapons if this is a trap. Kaelen gripped the yoke. I've been through the ridge before. It's tricky, but the snail is smaller than she looks. And as for traps, well, we have an ace pilot on board. I'm hoping you can at least tell us if something is coming. Vexra nodded, a look of grim determination on her face. I can do that. I will monitor the echo channels for any psychic residue. Turn the ship, Kaelen. Let's see if we can save someone else today. Kaelen swung the snail around the old engines, groaning in protest as they pushed against the change in momentum. The ship began to accelerate, heading toward the dark, jagged silhouette of the Thorn Ridge. As they approached the asteroid field, the space around them grew crowded with floating rocks, some the size of houses, others as large as cities. The opaline nebula's light reflected off their surfaces, creating a dizzying landscape of shadows and glare. Okay, Barnaby, Kaelen said, his voice tight with concentration. Switch the sensors to short-range pulse. I need to know where every pebble is. Vexra, I need you to keep an eye on the aft shields. If we clip something, I need to know immediately so I can compensate. I have it, she said, her hands moving over the co-pilot's board with a speed that made Kaelen's head spin. She wasn't just pushing buttons, she was dancing with the machine. Even without the echo link, she was miles ahead of any human pilot Kaelen had ever seen. The snail entered the ridge. It was a chaotic obstacle course. Kaelen had to weave the bulky freighter through narrow gaps between rotating boulders. The ship shuddered as small fragments of rock bounced off the hull, sounding like hailstones on a tin roof. You are doing well, Kaelen, Vexra said, her voice calm amidst the tension. Smooth movements. Do not overcorrect. Trust the ship. I'm trying, Kaelen grunted as he pulled a hard bank to avoid a jagged spire of obsidian. But the snail turns like a pregnant whale in a bathtub. Come on, girl, stay with me. The distress signal grew louder. On the screen, a small blip appeared, wedged into a crevice on a massive asteroid that looked like a shattered skull. It was a Union scout ship, its hull blackened by fire. Its engines were cold and its lights were dim. There they are, Kaelen said. I'm moving in for a docking maneuver. Wait, Vexra said, her ears twitching violently. I feel something. A ripple in the void. Kaelen froze. A trap? No, she said, her eyes narrowing. It's not a trap. It's hungry. From behind a nearby asteroid, a shadow emerged. It was not a ship. It was a void strider lurker, a biological entity that looked like a cross between a jellyfish and a nightmare. Its body was translucent and glowing with an oily purple light. It had long, barbed tentacles that trailed through the vacuum, seeking energy signatures to consume. It's a scavenger, Vexra whispered. It's waiting for the scout ship's power to fail, so it can eat the crew's biosigns. And now it sees us. The lurker turned its massive glowing eye toward the snail. It let out a pulse of energy that made the freighter's systems flicker and die. Barnaby, Kaelen shouted. The computer didn't answer. The bridge went dark, save for the eerie purple glow from the creature outside. The snail began to drift powerless in the middle of a graveyard of rocks. We have lost the main reactor, Vexra said, her voice steady despite the darkness. The lurker's pulse fried the primary couplings. "We are on emergency batteries only." Kaelen looked at the massive creature closing in. Its tentacles were already reaching for the snail's hull. He could see the rows of tiny hooked teeth on the underside of the limbs. "Can you hit it with something?" Kaelen asked. "A flare? A waste dump?" "We have no weapons, Kaelen," she reminded him, "and the batteries do not have enough power to jumpstart the engines while the lurker is dampening the field." Kaelen looked at the bobblehead stegosaurus. He thought about the manual bypass he had rigged years ago. He thought about the flutes. "Barnaby," he whispered, "if you can hear me, I need you to route all remaining battery power to the external cargo speakers." The computer's voice was a faint crackle in his ear. "That is ill-advised, Kaelen. We need that power for life support." "Do it!" Kaelen shouted. "Vexra, give me the frequency for the Athelian battle hymn, the one that uses the high-frequency harmonics." Vexra's eyes widened. "You want to sing to it?" "Lurkers are sensitive to sound vibrations in the hull," he said. "If we can vibrate the snail's skin at a frequency it hates, it might let go. It's a trick I read about in an old surveyor's journal." Vexra nodded her fingers, flying over the dead console as she pulled a manual override cable from beneath the dash. She plugged it into a small portable device she carried. "I have the frequency. It is a song of mourning. It is very loud." Kaelen gripped the dashboard. "On 3, 1, 2, 3. The ship didn't move, but a sound erupted that was so intense Kaelen felt his teeth rattle in his skull. It wasn't just noise. It was a physical force. The entire hull of the snail began to hum a deep, resonant thrum that shook the dust from the vents. Outside, the lurker recoiled. Its glowing eye pulsed in pain, and its tentacles pulled back from the metal as if they had been burned. It shivered, its translucent body rippling with distress. "It worked!" Kaelen shouted. "Barnaby, now! Jumpstart the reactor while its field is down!" The engines roared to life, a beautiful guttural sound that Kaelen had never loved more. The snail surged forward, narrowly missing the lurker as it fled back into the shadows of the asteroids. Kaelen didn't waste a second. He brought the freighter alongside the scout ship and engaged the magnetic tethers. Within minutes, the airlocks were connected, and the 2 survivors of the scout vessel were being hauled into the snail's cargo bay. Once they were clear of the ridge and back into the open space of the nebula, Kaelen slumped in his seat. His hands were shaking so hard he had to tuck them under his arms. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." Vexra was looking at him, her expression filled with a strange kind of wonder. "You used a song of my people to fight a nightmare," she said. "You took a ship with no guns and you made it a warrior." Kaelen shook his head. "I just didn't want to get eaten." He looked out the viewport. The stars were still there, distant and cold, but the silence between them didn't feel so empty anymore. He turned to Vexra. "You know, Colonel, I think the flutes might have been more effective. This song is a bit of a downer." Vexra laughed, a loud, clear sound that filled the small bridge. "Perhaps," she said, "but I think I prefer your version of a battle. Nobody died, and the paperwork will be fascinating." As the snail chugged toward Veloni's prime, Kaelen realized that he didn't care about the rumors anymore. He didn't care about the Vanguard or the medals. He had his ship, his music, and a co-pilot who finally saw him for who he really was. And for the first time in his life, Kaelen Vance decided that maybe being a hero wasn't about flying a fast ship. Maybe it was just about being the person who stays when everyone else runs away. Barnaby broke the silence. "Kaelen, I should inform you that the number 3 fuel pump has stopped stuttering. Apparently the high-frequency vibration fixed the alignment." Kaelen grinned. "See? Even the ship liked the song." Vexra leaned her head back, her eyes closing in the soft light. "It was a good song, Kaelen. It was a very good song." The snail drifted through the purple clouds of the nebula, a small, slow boat in an infinite ocean, carrying its cargo of lives and melodies toward the dawn. The atmosphere of Velonus Prime was a swirling masterpiece of violet and emerald, a gas giant's moon that looked far too beautiful to be the site of a grueling military research outpost. As the rusty snail descended through the upper ionosphere, the ship vibrated with a rhythmic violence that made Kaelen Vance wonder if the landing struts were about to become independent contractors. "Barnaby, give me a status on the heat shielding." Kaelen shouted over the roar of the atmospheric friction. The shielding is currently at 64% integrity, the computer replied, its voice remarkably calm for a machine whose outer hull was currently glowing orange. However, I should note that the portside thermal tiles are vibrating in a way that suggests they would rather be elsewhere, perhaps on a younger, more attractive ship. Just keep us in one piece, Kaelen grunted, fighting the flight yoke. Beside him, Vexra sat with her eyes closed, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. She wasn't using the controls, but her long, elegant ears were twitching in sync with the ship's groans. She was feeling the stress of the metal, the flow of the air, the very heartbeat of the snail. Ease the descent, Kaelen, she whispered, her voice cutting through the noise like a silk ribbon. The wind shear at 20,000 meters is jagged. Turn 3 degrees to starboard. Let the ship breathe. Kaelen followed her lead, nudging the bulky freighter into the pocket of calmer air she had sensed. The violent shaking subsided into a steady hum. He let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since they left the station. Remind me to never let you retire, he muttered. You're better than a localized weather satellite. I am simply listening, she replied, opening her eyes. They were a deep, swirling indigo now, reflecting the colors of the world below. The machines tell stories, Kaelen. Most pilots just don't like the ending. They broke through the cloud layer to reveal the research station, a cluster of white geodesic domes perched on a jagged obsidian cliff overlooking a sea of bioluminescent moss. It was a stunning view, but Kaelen's attention was caught by the ships already docked at the landing pads. There were 3 sleek Union diplomatic shuttles and a pair of heavy-duty security frigates. This wasn't in the mission briefing, Kaelen said, his brow furrowing as he guided the snail toward Pad 7. That's a lot of brass for a simple supply drop. The rumor mill has a long reach, Vexra said, her expression tightening. It seems our arrival is no longer a private matter. As the snail settled onto the pad with its signature hiss of hydraulic fluid and a metallic clunk that sounded suspiciously like a loose bolt hitting the deck, Kaelen saw a welcoming committee. At the head of the group stood Administrator Silas Thorne, a man whose uniform was so crisp it looked like it had been carved out of plastic. Beside him were several high-ranking researchers and a small squad of security detail in polished chrome armor. Kaelen smoothed down his grease-stained flight jacket and checked his reflection in a darkened monitor. He looked like a man who had slept in a closet and lived on a diet of synthetic protein cubes, which, to be fair, was exactly what he was. Vexra, on the other hand, stepped out of the airlock looking like a celestial queen, her silver hair shimmering in the alien sunlight. "Colonel Val Taris," Thorne exclaimed, stepping forward with a smile that didn't quite reach his calculating eyes. "A surprise and a profound honor. We were informed you were flying unconventional transport." He glanced at the rusty snail as if it were a pile of refuse that had accidentally gained sentience. "It is a functional vessel, Administrator," Vexra said coolly, "and its pilot, Kaelen Vance, has shown more skill in the last 48 hours than half the Academy graduates I've seen this year." Thorne's gaze flicked to Kaelen, lingering for a fraction of a second on the grease under his fingernails. "Of course, Pilot Vance, the man of the hour. Your musical choices during the Battle of Opaline have become something of a legend among the staff here. Quite the tactical innovator." Kaelen felt the familiar heat rising in his ears. "It was a glitch, sir. I was just trying to do my job." "And a fine job it was," Thorne said, though his tone suggested he was talking to a particularly clever dog. "Now please come inside. We have prepared a formal dinner to celebrate our guests and to discuss the recent findings regarding the Void Strider signals in this sector." "I have cargo to unload," Kaelen said, gesturing back toward the snail. "Regulations state—" "The automated drones will handle the crates, pilot," Thorne interrupted smoothly. "Tonight, you are not a delivery man. You are a guest of the Union, and I insist you attend." 2 hours later, Kaelen found himself encased in a formal dress tunic that felt like it had been designed by someone who hated the concept of breathing. He stood in the corner of a grand dining hall, clutching a glass of blue sparkling liquid that smelled like industrial solvent. The room was filled with the elite of Velonis Prime, scientists, politicians, and officers who all seemed to be speaking a language of acronyms and condescension. Across the room, Vexra was surrounded by a gaggle of researchers, all of them asking impossible questions about Athelian biology and the echolink. She looked composed, but Kaelen could see the slight downward tilt of her ears. She was miserable. "You look like you're waiting for a hull breach," a voice said beside him. Kaelen turned to see a young researcher in a lab coat, her hair a chaotic nest of curls. She held a data pad in one hand and a half-eaten protein bar in the other. "Is it that obvious?" Kaelen asked. "You're standing near the emergency exit and your eyes are tracking the ceiling vents," she said, grinning. "I'm Dr. Alara. I run the atmospheric monitoring team, and for the record, I think the elevator music was a stroke of genius. It broke the encryption on the Void Strider comms for 3 whole seconds because they didn't know how to process the woodwinds." Kaelen chuckled, feeling a tiny bit of the tension leave his shoulders. "I'll tell Barnaby. He'll be thrilled his programming finally served a military purpose." "Don't let these suits get to you," Alara whispered, nodding toward Thorn. "They're just bored. Velanis is a beautiful prison, and you're the first interesting thing to happen here since the moss turned purple 3 years ago. They want to turn you into a story so they can feel like they're part of the war instead of just watching it through a telescope." "I don't want to be a story," Kaelen said softly. "I just want to be the guy who gets the meds to the people who need them." "That's the problem, pilot," Alara said, her smile fading. "The Union doesn't need people. It needs symbols. And right now, a humble cargo pilot who rescues soldiers while playing flutes is the best symbol they've got. It makes the war look manageable, human." Kaelen looked over at Vexra. She had caught his eye, and for a brief second, the distance between them vanished. She gave him a tiny, imperceptible nod, a silent plea for help. Kaelen put down his glass. "Excuse me, Doctor. I think I need to rescue a colonel." He navigated the crowd, dodging 3 admirals and a very persistent historian, until he reached Vexra's side. "Pardon me, everyone," Kaelen said, his voice loud enough to interrupt a particularly dull lecture on psychic resonance. "But I believe the colonel and I have a scheduled maintenance check on the snail's reactor. We have a very finicky fuel pump that requires Athelian oversight." Vexra's relief was palpable. "He is correct. The alignment is quite delicate. Administrator, thank you for the hospitality, but duty calls." Thorn looked annoyed, but he couldn't very well argue with a reactor malfunction. "Very well, but we shall resume our discussion tomorrow morning regarding the tactical applications of the Athelian song Pilot Vance used in the Ridge." Once they were back in the cool, quiet shadows of the hangar bay, Vexra let out a long, shuddering sigh. She leaned against the landing strut of the snail, her silver hair falling forward. "Thank you," she said. "I was beginning to feel like a piece of lab equipment." "Ah, Nadina, you and me both," Kaelen said, unbuttoning the collar of his tunic. "I think I'm allergic to formal wear. And politics. Mostly politics." "They don't see us, Kaelen," Vexra said, her voice heavy with weariness. "They see a weapon and a mascot. They want us to be the heroes of their propaganda films, but they don't want to know about the blood or the fear. They certainly don't want to know that the legendary Vexra of Altaris is tired of the stars." Kaelen walked over to her, standing just close enough to feel the coolness of the alien night air between them. "I see you, Vexra. I see the pilot who was worried about a fuel pump stutter, and I see the person who just wanted a quiet meal." Vexra looked up at him, her indigo eyes shimmering with a sudden, intense light. "And I see you, Kaelen Vance, the man who thinks he is ordinary while doing extraordinary things. You think your lack of ambition is a flaw, but it is the only thing that makes you real in a world of ghosts." She reached out, her fingers grazing his sleeve. "Don't let them change you. Don't let them turn your kindness into a weapon." Kaelen was about to respond when the ground beneath them shivered. It wasn't the vibration of a ship landing. It was a deep tectonic groan that seemed to come from the heart of the moon itself. Above them, the geodesic domes of the station began to hum with a discordant, high-pitched frequency. "Barnaby!" Kaelen shouted, tapping his earcom. "Status report!" "Kaelen, I recommend you return to the ship immediately," the computer said, its voice crackling with static. "The atmospheric stabilizer, the Aegis, has just suffered a massive energy surge. My sensors are detecting a high concentration of Void Strider signatures. But they aren't in space, Kaelen." Kaelen's heart sank. "Where are they?" "They are inside the station's power grid," Barnaby replied, "and they are eating the air." The screams began 30 seconds after the power went out. Inside the rusty snail, the emergency red lights bathed the bridge in a bloody glow. Kaelen was already in the pilot's seat, his fingers flying across the manual overrides. Vexra was beside him, her face pale, her hands pressed against her temples. "Vexra? What is it?" Kaelen asked, his voice tight with alarm. "The Echo Link," she gasped, her ears pinned back in pain. "It's screaming. The Void Striders aren't just attacking the grid, they're using the station's psychic amplifiers to broadcast a frequency of pure despair. It's tearing at my mind, Kaelen. I can't think." Kaelen grabbed her hand, his own palm rough and warm against her cool skin. "Look at me. Ignore the noise. Focus on the ship. The snail doesn't have an echo link. She's just metal and grease. She's silent, Vexra. Listen to the silence." Vexra took a ragged breath, her eyes locking onto his. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders began to dissipate. "The silence," she whispered. "Yes, it's better." "Barnaby, talk to me," Kaelen barked. "What's the situation outside?" "The Aegis stabilizer is failing," Barnaby reported, the screen flickering with distorted data. "The void rot has infected the primary capacitors. Without the stabilizer, the moon's atmosphere will dissipate into the vacuum within 20 minutes. Approximately 4,000 people are currently on this outpost. Most of them are currently running in circles and shouting, which I find to be an inefficient use of oxygen." "Can we fix the stabilizer?" Kaelen asked, throwing his flight jacket back on. "The high-tech repair drones have all been deactivated by the rot," Barnaby said. "The Union's latest technology is currently its greatest weakness. The rot feeds on sophisticated energy signatures. Anything with an AI or a psychic interface is being consumed." Kaelen looked at the dashboard. He looked at the manual levers, the copper wire bypasses, and the bobblehead stegosaurus. "What about us?" Kaelen asked. "The snail is basically a fossil. Does the rot see us?" "We are beneath its notice, Kaelen," the computer said with a hint of what might have been pride. "Our technology is so primitive that the Void Striders likely mistake us for a stray asteroid. However, if we attempt to fly into the eye of the stabilizer to perform a manual reset, we will be exposed to the full force of the atmospheric collapse." Vexra stood up, her legs still a bit shaky but her eyes clear. "I can do it. I can guide us in. My senses are duller without the link, but I can still feel the wind." "No," Kaelen said, standing up to face her. "You can barely stand, Vexra. The noise out there is going to be 10 times worse than it is in here. If you go out there, the rot will find you." "Then who?" she asked. Kaelen pointed to himself. "The guy who is too soft for combat. The guy who knows how to fix a reactor with a screwdriver and a piece of gum. I'm going in." "Kaelen, you can't fly the snail into the eye alone," Vexra argued. "The turbulence alone will tear the hull apart. You need someone to manage the power distribution and the manual seals." "I'll do it," a new voice said. Kaelen and Vexra turned to see Dr. Alara standing at the airlock, her lab coat torn and her face smudged with soot. She was carrying a heavy toolkit. "I know the Aegis better than anyone, and I'm not psychic, so the rot won't find my brain as tasty as the Colonel's." "Doctor, it's suicide," Kaelen said. "It's 4,000 lives, pilot," she snapped, her eyes fierce. "Now move your butt. We've got 18 minutes of air left." Kaelen looked at Vexra. She nodded slowly, her hand lingering on his arm. "I will stay here and coordinate the evacuation signals using the snail's shortwave radio. It's the only thing the rot isn't jamming. Go, Kaelen. Be the man who doesn't seek glory." Kaelen grabbed his toolkit and followed Alara out of the ship. The hangar was a scene of pure chaos. Emergency lights were flickering, and the air was already growing thin and cold. People were fighting for seats on the few functional shuttles, but without the station's docking computers, the ships were grounded. "This way," Alara shouted, leading him toward a small maintenance elevator that looked like it had been built before the invention of the wheel. They descended into the heart of the station, the metal groaning as the atmospheric pressure outside began to drop. Kaelen could feel the vibration of the void rot, a sickening, oily pulse that made his skin crawl. They reached the stabilizer core, a massive chamber filled with humming machinery that was now covered in a pulsating, purple slime. In the center of the room sat the Aegis, a towering spire of crystalline tech that was flickering like a dying candle. "The rot has coated the primary contact points," Ilara shouted over the howling wind as air began to leak through the emergency seals. The automated systems can't clear it. We have to do it by hand. With what? Kaelen asked, looking at the corrosive purple sludge. The industrial solvent in your ship's cabin, Ilara said. The blue stuff you were drinking. It's high alkaline. It'll dissolve the rot's organic bonds. Kaelen stared at her. I was drinking industrial solvent? It was a diplomatic reception, Vance. Everything is industrial solvent, she screamed. Just pour it on the contacts and I'll pull the manual reset lever. Kaelen didn't hesitate. He scrambled up the crystalline spire, his boots slipping on the purple slime. The wind was roaring now, pulling at his clothes, trying to suck him out through the microscopic fissures in the hull. He could hear the void striders, not with his ears, but with his bones. A chattering, hungry sound that wanted to consume everything he was. He reached the primary contacts. He pulled the bottle from his belt, the one he'd swiped from the dinner table as a souvenir of his discomfort, and smashed it against the metal. The blue liquid splashed across the rot, and the slime began to hiss and shrivel, pulling back from the contact points. Now! Kaelen yelled. Below him, Ilara threw her weight against a massive iron lever. The Aegis groaned, a sound like a giant awakening. A pulse of pure white light erupted from the core, slamming into Kaelen and throwing him back against the wall. For a moment, everything went white. Kaelen felt himself falling. He felt the air leaving his lungs. He thought about the rusty snail. He thought about the flutes. He thought about the way Vexra looked when she smiled. I'm sorry, Barnaby, he thought. I think I broke the ship. But then he felt a hand on his collar. He was dragged across the floor, away from the roaring center of the room. He gasped for air, his lungs burning. Is it working? He wheezed. Ilara was leaning over him, her face lit by the steady white glow of the stabilizer. The Aegis is back online, pilot. The atmosphere is stabilizing. You did it. You actually did it. Kaelen sat up, his head spinning. He looked at his hands. They were covered in purple slime and blue liquid. He looked like a mess. He felt like a failure. But outside, he could hear the sound of the hangar doors reopening. He could hear the sound of people breathing. They made their way back to the snail, moving slowly through the recovering station. When they reached the hangar, they found Vexra standing at the ramp. She looked like she had aged 10 years in the last 20 minutes. But when she saw Kaelen, her face transformed. She didn't say a word. She simply walked over and pulled him into a hug. It wasn't a formal hug. It was the desperate, crushing embrace of someone who had thought they had lost the only real thing in their universe. You're a mess, she whispered into his shoulder. I know, Kaelen said, his voice cracking. I think I ruined the suit. Good, she said, pulling back to look at him. It never fit you anyway. But as the cheers began to rise from the station staff, and as Thorne and his diplomats began to emerge from their bunkers to claim credit for the coordinated recovery effort, Kaelen saw the look in Thorne's eyes. The administrator wasn't looking at the lives that had been saved. He was looking at Kaelen with a new, terrifying hunger. A manual reset under void rot conditions, Thorne said, his voice echoing in the hangar. Extraordinary. Pilot Vance, you have just proven that the human element is the ultimate weapon against the Striders. The High Command is going to want to study this. They're going to want to study you. Kaelen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the vacuum of space. He looked at Vexra, and he saw the same fear reflected in her eyes. The lesson was beginning to take shape, but the cost was becoming clear. By showing his worth, Kaelen had not gained his freedom. He had only made himself a more valuable prize. Barnaby, Kaelen said quietly as they boarded the snail. Yes, Kaelen. How much fuel do we have left? Enough to get to the next sector, Kaelen. Why? Kaelen looked at the crowd of people who were already beginning to treat him like a miracle instead of a man. Because I think we're about to go dark. The stars beyond the viewport of the rusty snail were no longer distant flickers of hope. They were cold, silent witnesses to a hunt. 3 hours had passed since the atmospheric stabilizer on Velonis Prime had been reset, and the euphoria of survival had been replaced by the suffocating weight of being hunted. Kaelen Vance sat in the pilot's seat, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the worn flight yoke. Barnaby, give me a passive scan of the trailing wake, Kaelen whispered, as if the walls of the ship had ears. I am detecting 4 distinct ion signatures, roughly 20,000 kilometers behind us, Kaelen, the computer replied. They are maintaining a steady distance, hiding within our engine's thermal ghost. They are Onyx Vanguard interceptors. If I were a betting machine, which I am, given the current pool in the lower decks, I would say they are not here to offer us a victory parade. They're tracking my biosignature, Kaelen muttered, rubbing his eyes. Thorn wasn't joking. They don't want a pilot. They want a blueprint. Beside him, Vexra was curled in the co-pilot's chair, her silver hair spilling over her shoulders like a frozen waterfall. She looked smaller than she had a few days ago, her usual aura of untouchable grace dampened by the lingering psychic trauma of the void rot. Her long ears were pressed flat against her head, a sign of deep distress in her species. They are coming for the resonance, Kaelen, she said, her voice a fragile rasp. The Union has spent 50 years trying to build the perfect soldier. They built the Wraiths. They perfected the Echo Link. They turned my people into living processors. And yet, a man in a freighter with a bottle of industrial solvent did what 1,000 ace pilots couldn't. To Thorn, you aren't a hero. You are a biological anomaly that needs to be dissected and replicated. Kaelen felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. I'm a freighter pilot, Vexra. I have a mortgage on a small apartment on Mars and a collection of vintage comic books. There's nothing to dissect. Your mind works without the interface, she said, turning to look at him. Her iridescent eyes were clouded with worry. In a galaxy where every ship is a hive mind, your independence is a weapon. They will strip you down to see how you think, how you resist the despair. They will turn your kindness into a series of algorithms. Suddenly, the long-range comms terminal chirped. It wasn't the standard Union hail. It was a high-priority encrypted channel. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the sharp plastic features of Administrator Silas Thorn. He was sitting in a darkened command center, the glow of tactical maps reflecting off his forehead. Pilot Vance, Thorn said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly reasonable. I noticed you took an unscheduled detour after the incident. I assume you were simply disoriented by the energy surge. I have sent Captain Jackson and his wing to escort you back to the bastion of Helios. We have a medical team waiting to ensure you haven't suffered any long-term exposure to the rot. I'm fine, Administrator, Kaelen said, his voice shaking slightly. The snail needs some repairs that can only be done at a civilian dock. I'll check in once I've landed. That is not a request, Kaelen. Thorn's expression didn't change, but his tone dropped several degrees. You are a vital asset to the Galactic Union. Your performance on Velanis has opened up new avenues for our defense strategy. We cannot risk your safety. Turn your ship around and dock with Captain Jackson immediately. If you do not comply, we will be forced to disable your engines for your own protection. Disable my engines? Kaelen barked, a surge of adrenaline finally overriding his fear. In the middle of a nebula? That's a death sentence and you know it, you plastic-faced bureaucrat. A necessary risk for the greater good, Thorn replied. You have 10 minutes to comply. Do not make this difficult, pilot. You are a hero. Act like one. The transmission cut to black. Kaelen stared at the empty space where Thorn's face had been. 10 minutes. He's giving me 10 minutes to choose between being a lab rat and a target. Kaelen, look at the sensor feed, Vexra said, her voice regaining some of its steel. The 4 ion signatures were no longer trailing. They had broken formation and were accelerating, flanking the snail from the top and bottom. They were moving into an interdiction pattern. Jackson, Kaelen spat. He's been waiting for an excuse to scrap this ship since I met him. Barnaby, what happens if I dump the remaining coolant into the thrusters? The ship will accelerate to 112% of its rated maximum, the computer said, and then, approximately 3 minutes later, the engines will melt into a very expensive puddle of slag. We will be the fastest debris in the sector for exactly 180 seconds. Better than a cage, Kaelen said. He looked at Vexra. If we do this, there's no going back. We'll be deserters, traitors. They'll hunt us to the edge of the galaxy. Vexra reached out, her cool fingers interlocking with his. I have been a weapon for 80 years, Kaelen. I would rather be a traitor with a soul than a hero without a heart. Let's go dark. Huh? Kaelen grinned, a jagged, desperate thing. Barnaby, prime the coolant dump, and find me the thickest, nastiest part of the Opaline Nebula. If we're going to disappear, I want to do it in a place where their fancy sensors can't find their own exhaust ports. Calculating a course for the Rift of Silence, Barnaby said. Warning, navigation within the rift is considered impossible for 89% of known vessels. Fortunately, we are in the remaining 11% that is too stupid to realize it's impossible. Punch it! Kaelen yelled. The rusty snail groaned as if it were being torn apart from the inside. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the hull as the coolant hit the reactor, and for a moment, the world outside the viewport became a blur of violet light. The G-force slammed Kaelen back into his seat, his vision tunneling. Behind them, the 4 Onyx interceptors flared their engines in pursuit. But they were built for agility, not raw, suicidal thrust. The snail surged ahead like a kicked mule, plunging into the swirling, opaque clouds of the rift. Inside the nebula, the sensors went blind. The HUD flickered and died, replaced by static. The only light came from the occasional flash of ion lightning outside and the dim red emergency lamps of the bridge. "We're in," Kaelen wheezed, gasping for air as the acceleration leveled off. "Barnaby, kill the transponder. Shut down everything except life support and the short-range scanners." "Engines are currently cooling," Barnaby reported. "Or rather, they are screaming in agony. We are drifting, Kaelen. We have successfully gone dark. We are officially ghosts." Kaelen slumped in his seat, his heart hammering. He looked over at Vexra. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wide as she looked into the darkness of the nebula. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually ran." "I didn't run," Kaelen said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I performed a strategic withdrawal from an unfavorable social situation." They sat in the silence of the drifting ship for a long time. There was no hum of the station, no chatter on the comms, no weight of expectations. It was just the two of them, floating in a sea of violet gas. But as the minutes turned into hours, the silence began to feel different. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a presence. The Rift of Silence was known for its unique psychic properties. A place where the background noise of the universe was muffled, allowing the inner thoughts of those within it to resonate. Vexra closed her eyes, her ears twitching softly. "It's so quiet here," she said. "I can hear myself." For the first time in decades, the voices of the fleet are gone. The echo link is silent. "Is that a good thing?" Kaelen asked. "It is terrifying," she admitted. "Without the noise, I am just Vexra. I am not the ace. I am not the oracle. I am just a woman who is 80 years old and has never known a day without war. I don't know who that person is, Kaelen." Kaelen unbuckled his harness and stood up, moving clumsily in the low gravity. He walked over to her and knelt beside her chair. "I know who she is. She's the person who likes actual fruit and thinks my music is terrible. She's the person who stayed on this ship when she could have walked away a dozen times. That person is enough, Vexra. You don't need a fleet to tell you who you are." Vexra looked at him, and for the first time, Kaelen saw a tear track down her sky-blue cheek. "And you? The man who saved 4,000 people and then ran away because he didn't want a medal? Who are you, Kaelen Vance?" Kaelen looked at his hands, the grease-stained, shaking hands of a man who was way out of his depth. "I'm just the guy who stays," he said. "When the fast ships leave and the heroes are busy posing for the cameras, I'm the guy who picks up the pieces." "I used to think that made me a failure. I thought it meant I wasn't brave enough to be a warrior." He looked out at the nebula, a sudden clarity washing over him. "But I think I was wrong. Courage isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being the one who refuses to let the world become a colder place, even when it's trying to freeze you out. I'm the pilot of the rusty snail, and right now, that's exactly who I want to be." Vexra leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. "Then we are both exactly where we need to be." The moment was broken by a sudden, violent jolt that sent Kaelen sprawling across the deck. The ship didn't just shake, it groaned with a sound that felt like it was coming from a living throat. "Barnaby, what was that?" Kaelen shouted, scrambling back to his seat. "Kaelen, I have very bad news," the computer said, its voice distorted by massive interference. "The Rift of Silence is no longer silent. A massive energy signature has just entered the sector. It is not Union. It is not Athelian." Kaelen looked at the viewport. The violet clouds were being pushed aside by a massive, pulsing shadow. It was kilometers long, a biomechanical nightmare of jagged obsidian and glowing purple veins. It looked like a hive, a city, and a predator all rolled into one. "A Void Strider Prime," Vexra whispered, her face draining of color. "The hive ship. It followed the scent of the rot from Velonis." "But we're in the rift," Kaelen yelled. "Nothing can find us here." "It's not looking for us," Vexra said, her eyes wide with horror as she looked at the tactical map that was slowly coming back to life. "Look at its course. It's heading straight for the bastion of Helios. It's not hunting us, Kaelen. It's going to finish what it started." And then the scream began. It wasn't a sound. It was a psychic tidal wave that slammed into the ship, a pulse of pure, unadulterated agony and hunger. Kaelen felt as if a hot iron had been pressed against his brain. He gasped, falling to his knees. But Vexra was in a different world of pain. She arched her back, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes rolling back in her head. Her long ears were bleeding. "Vexra!" Kaelen crawled toward her, his own mind fractured by the noise. The Void Strider Prime had begun its broadcast. It was the siren song of the hive, a frequency designed to paralyze any ship with an echo link or a high-level AI. "Barnaby? Status?" Kaelen wheezed. "System. Failure." Barnaby's voice was a dying whisper. "Psychic. Interference. Overloading. Core." Kaelen looked out the window. In the distance, at the edge of the nebula, he could see the lights of the Union fleet. The Onyx Vanguard, the escort ships, the frigates. They weren't moving. They were drifting, their lights flickering and dying. The most advanced fleet in the galaxy had just been turned into a collection of floating coffins. The rusty snail was the only thing still breathing. Its primitive, manual systems were the only things that couldn't hear the song of the hive. Kaelen looked at Vexra, who was convulsing in her seat. He looked at the fleet that had just tried to kidnap him, and then he looked at the manual controls of his ship. He had a choice. He could stay in the nebula and wait for the hive to pass. He could stay hidden and live. Or he could do the one thing a freighter pilot was never supposed to do. He could fly into the fire. "Barnaby, if you can still hear me, I need you to give me everything," Kaelen shouted, his voice hoarse from the psychic pressure. "Route the emergency batteries into the manual thruster bypass. We're going out there." "Kaelen, the risk is total." Barnaby's voice was barely a crackle. "The hive. We'll see. You. Let them look." Kaelen slammed his hand onto the manual ignition. The rusty snail didn't roar this time. It shrieked. The engines, already damaged from the coolant dump, threw out a trail of sparks and black smoke as they pushed the ship out of the nebula's protection. Kaelen steered with one hand, his other hand firmly gripping Vexra's shoulder. He could feel her pulse, rapid and erratic. She was drowning in the hive's scream. "Stay with me, Vexra," he pleaded. "Listen to my voice. It's not a weapon. It's just me. It's just Kaelen." He looked ahead. The Void Strider Prime was looming over the Union fleet like a giant spider over a web of paralyzed flies. The Onyx interceptors were floating helplessly, their pilots trapped in a psychic loop of their own worst memories. Even Jackson's ship was silent, its gold plating dull in the shadow of the monster. "They're all going to die," Kaelen whispered. 4,000 on the station, thousands more in the fleet, all because they built ships that were too smart to survive. He checked the cargo manifest on his flickering datapad. He had 30 crates of high-grade medical supplies, 50 barrels of industrial lubricant, and a 3-ton shipment of agricultural sonic emitters destined for a colony on the far side of the sector. The sonic emitters. "Barnaby," Kaelen yelled, "can we link the agricultural emitters to the external hull plates?" "The frequency is for killing weeds," Barnaby replied. "A Void Strider is just a very big weed," Kaelen said, his eyes narrowing. "If we can broadcast a discordant, non-psychic frequency, we might be able to create a static bubble around the fleet. It won't kill the hive ship, but it might wake up our pilots." "Manual link required," Barnaby said. "You have to go outside." Kaelen froze. "Outside? In the middle of a psychic war zone? The emitters are in the cargo bay exterior rack. Kaelen looked at Vexra. She had stopped convulsing, but she was limp, her eyes staring at nothing. If he didn't do this, she would never wake up. Her mind would be consumed by the hive before the ship ever reached the bastion. "Take care of her, Barnaby," Kaelen said, grabbing his pressure suit helmet. "I am a computer." "Kaelen, I cannot." "Just don't let the air out," Kaelen snapped, slamming the helmet into place. He scrambled to the airlock, the ship bucking and weaving as the Void Strider's gravity wells began to tug at the hull. He stepped into the small chamber, the hiss of depressurization ringing in his ears. When the outer door opened, the universe exploded into a kaleidoscope of terrifying color. Space was not empty. It was filled with the purple threads of the hive's energy, weaving through the fleet like a web. Kaelen stepped onto the exterior hull of the snail, his magnetic boots clanking against the metal. The noise was different out here. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical weight pressing against his chest. He could feel the hive's thoughts, vast, cold, and ancient. It didn't hate the humans. It simply viewed them as fuel. Kaelen crawled toward the cargo rack, his fingers fumbling with the heavy latches. The snail was vibrating so violently he almost lost his grip. Below him, the massive hive ship began to open its primary maw, a glowing pit of energy that was preparing to strip the atmosphere from the nearby cruiser. "Not today," Kaelen gritted his teeth, tearing the cover off the first emitter. He pulled the manual override cable from his belt and jammed it into the emitter's port. He had to do this 6 times. 6 emitters, 6 cables, all linked back to the snail's primitive core. As he worked, a shadow fell over him. One of the Void Strider's scout pods, a small, clicking thing the size of a car, had noticed the activity on the freighter. It drifted toward the snail, its barbed tentacles reaching out. Kaelen didn't have a weapon. He didn't even have a flare gun. He looked at the scout pod, and then he looked at the wrench in his hand. "Get bent!" he screamed, throwing the heavy tool at the pod's sensor eye. The wrench hit with a satisfying thud, and the pod recoiled, confused by the sudden physical impact. It wasn't used to things that didn't fight back with energy or thought. Kaelen jammed the last cable into place. "Barnaby, now! Play the loudest, ugliest thing you've got." Back in the cockpit, Barnaby didn't play music. He didn't play a battle hymn. He simply opened the channel to the agricultural emitters and let out a raw, distorted blast of white noise, the sound of 1,000 malfunctioning tractors and 1,000,000 broken radios. The effect was instantaneous. The psychic web around the snail shattered. The white noise wasn't psychic. It was pure physical vibration. It tore through the hive's delicate frequency like a chainsaw through silk. Kaelen scrambled back into the airlock, falling inside as the door hissed shut. He stripped off his helmet, gasping for air. On the bridge, the monitors were flashing green. "Static. Bubble. Established," Barnaby reported, his voice finally clear. "The Onyx Vanguard is responding." Kaelen looked out the viewport. Across the sector, the lights of the Union ships were turning from red to blue. He saw Jackson's interceptor twitch, its thrusters firing as the pilot regained consciousness. The psychic scream had been drowned out by the ugly noise of the snail. "Vexra!" Kaelen ran to her chair. She gasped, her eyes snapping into focus. She looked around, her chest heaving. "The noise! It stopped." "Kaelen, what did you do?" "I broadcasted a very loud complaint about the weather," Kaelen said, catching her as she slumped forward. "Are you okay?" "I can breathe," she whispered, leaning into him. "I can hear you again." But the hive ship was not defeated. Angered by the interference, it turned its massive obsidian bulk toward the rusty snail. It ignored the waking fleet. It ignored the station. It wanted the source of the noise. "Kaelen, it's coming for us," Vexra said, her voice trembling. Kaelen looked at the massive shadow closing in. The snail was out of coolant, out of batteries, and its hull was vibrating so hard the rivets were starting to pop. "Barnaby, can we run?" "Negative, Kaelen. Engines are at 0%. We are a sitting duck, a very noisy sitting duck." Kaelen gripped Vexra's hand. He looked at the hive ship, and then he looked at the fleet he had saved. They were all moving now, forming up, their weapons charging, but they were too far away. They wouldn't reach the snail in time. I guess this is it, Kaelen said softly. Not exactly the ending I had in mind. Vexra looked at him, and her eyes were no longer indigo. They were a brilliant, burning gold. She stood up, her ears angling forward with a fierce, regal intensity. No, she said, it is not the end. You saved them with your humanity, Kaelen. Now let me show you what an ace can do when she finally knows who she is. She didn't sit in the chair. She stood in the center of the bridge, her hands held out as if she were embracing the stars. She didn't use the echo link. She didn't connect to the ship's computer. She connected to the static. She took the raw, ugly noise of the agricultural emitters and she began to shape it. She used her psychic talent not to listen to the hive, but to conduct the white noise. The rusty snail began to glow. A field of pure, shimmering resonance erupted from the hull, expanding outward in a perfect sphere. It wasn't a weapon of destruction. It was a shield of absolute truth. When the hive ship's energy beam hit the snail, it didn't explode. It reflected. The energy was turned back on the monster, amplified by Vexra's will. The hive ship shrieked, a physical sound that shattered asteroids for 1,000 kilometers. Its obsidian hull began to crack, the purple veins turning black and brittle. It couldn't handle the resonance. It was a creature of shadows, and Vexra was throwing the sun at it. Now, Vexra cried out, her voice echoing through the ship. All ships, fire! From the darkness, 100 beams of light converged on the Void Strider Prime. The Onyx Vanguard, the frigates, the station's defense turrets. Everyone fired at once. The hive ship exploded in a silent blossom of violet and white, its remains scattering into the nebula. Silence returned to the sector, a real silence. Kaelen sat on the floor, leaning against the dashboard. He was covered in sweat. His heart felt like it had run a marathon, and he was pretty sure he had broken at least 2 toes. He looked up at Vexra. She was still standing, her silver hair floating in the low gravity. She looked at her hands, then at Kaelen. She gave him a small, weary smile. You were right, she said. It was a very good song. Outside, the Union fleet began to move toward them, but they weren't moving with the precision of a military parade. They were moving slowly, almost reverently. Jackson's ship pulled alongside the snail. A communication channel opened. There was no arrogance in his voice this time. There was only a profound, humbled confusion. Aurora Cargo 17, Rusty Snail. Do you copy? Jackson asked. Kaelen reached up and keyed the comm. We copy, Captain? Is there a problem? Did we park in the wrong docking lane? There was a long pause. No, Jackson said, his voice cracking. No problem. We're coming to bring you home. Kaelen looked at Vexra. He knew that home was going to be complicated. Thorn was still out there. The Union was still hungry for symbols. But as he looked at the patched hull of his ship and the woman standing beside him, he realized he wasn't afraid anymore. He had learned the lesson. He wasn't just a pilot. He wasn't just a human. He was the resonance that kept the darkness at bay. Barnaby, Kaelen said, leaning his head back. Yes, Kaelen? Find me that elevator music, the one with the flutes. I think we've earned a victory lap. I believe I have Volume 8, The Peaceful Meadow, on standby, the computer replied. It is, objectively, even worse than Volume 7. Shall I play it on all frequencies? Kaelen grinned. All frequencies, Barnaby. Let's give them something to talk about. As the soft, tinkling bells of the meditation music began to fill the bridge, the rusty snail drifted toward the fleet, a slow, ugly, perfect hero in a galaxy that was finally beginning to listen. The hull of the rusty snail did not sing. It groaned with the exhausted cadence of a machine that had been pushed 3 steps past its breaking point. In the immediate aftermath of the Void Strider Prime's destruction, the silence of the sector felt heavy, almost liquid. It was a silence earned by the screams of high-frequency agricultural emitters and the impossible resonance of an Athelian who had decided to stop being a weapon. Kaelen Vance sat on the floor of the bridge, his back against the cooling metal of the primary console. His hands were still trembling, a rhythmic vibration that he couldn't seem to shut off. He looked at his boots. One was missing a lace, and both were coated in a fine layer of purple dust from the void rot. Barnaby, Kaelen wheezed. his voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. Are we still... We? We are currently at 82% structural integrity, Kaelen, the computer replied. Its voice was flickering, occasionally dipping into a strange hollow tone that suggested its core processors had been rattled by the psychic surge. However, the number 3 fuel pump has decided to retire. It is no longer making a stuttering sound because it is no longer a pump. It is now a paperweight. On the bright side, the agricultural emitters are still functional. If we encounter any space weeds, they are in a world of trouble. Kaelen gave a weak, jagged laugh. He turned his head to look at Vexra. She was back in the co-pilot's chair, her silver hair matted with sweat, her eyes closed. She looked fragile, but the golden light that had burned in her eyes during the climax hadn't entirely faded. It lingered like a sunset behind her indigo irises. "You okay?" he asked. Vexra opened her eyes and looked at him. She didn't look like a colonel. She didn't look like an ace. She looked like someone who had just woken up from a very long, very loud nightmare. "The noise, it's different now, Kaelen. The fleet. I can feel them. They aren't screaming anymore. They're just breathing." A shadow fell over the viewport. The sleek, gold-trimmed interceptor of Captain Jackson drifted alongside the snail. The cockpit glass was clear enough for Kaelen to see the man inside. Jackson wasn't saluting. He was just staring at the freighter, his helmet tucked under one arm, his expression one of profound, shattered ego. The comms unit chirped. It wasn't a military hail. It was a person-to-person line. "Vance," Jackson's voice came through. It was stripped of its usual bravado, sounding raw and small. "The medical frigates are moving in. They're reporting that the psychic paralysis is lifting across the entire fleet. We owe you. Both of you." Kaelen looked at the dashboard. "You don't owe me anything, Captain. Just don't let anyone park a fuel cart near me for the next 48 hours. I don't think my heart can take the stress." There was a long pause on the other end. "I thought you were a dust eater, Vance. I thought you were just a gearhead who couldn't cut it in the big leagues. But I've spent my whole life training for a war I didn't understand. You just saved us with a tractor beam and some bad music." "It's a classic, Jackson," Kaelen muttered. "Don't knock the flutes." "We're escorting you back to the bastion," Jackson said, his voice regaining a bit of its professional clip. "Thorn is already on the horn with high command. He's calling it the Vance maneuver. He's talking about retrofitting the entire fleet with manual overrides and sonic shielding." Kaelen's stomach did a slow, nauseous somersault. He looked at Vexra, and he saw the same dread reflected in her ears, which had twitched sharply at the mention of Thorn. "He doesn't get it, does he?" Vexra said softly as the comms cut out. "He thinks it was the technology. He thinks if he can just replicate the noise, he can control the outcome." "He wants to turn the snail into a laboratory," Kaelen said, his hand tightening on the armrest. "And he wants to turn us into the lead researchers, or the test subjects." "I know that look, Vexra. I saw it back at the academy. People like Thorn don't see individuals. They see utility. We've become too useful to be left alone." The journey back to the bastion of Helios felt like a funeral procession masquerading as a victory lap. Dozens of ships, from massive cruisers to tiny scout craft, fell into formation around the battered freighter. It was the kind of honor usually reserved for the return of an emperor, but to Kaelen, it felt like the walls of a cage closing in. As they docked in the main hangar, Hangar 1, the prestigious zone reserved for heroes, Kaelen felt a profound sense of disconnection. The place was teeming with reporters, generals, and scientists. There were cameras floating on gravity pucks, their lenses swiveling to catch the first glimpse of the human hero. When the airlock hissed open, Kaelen stepped out into a wall of white light and thunderous applause. Thousands of people were cheering. Uniformed officers were snapping salutes so hard it looked like they might break their wrists. Administrator Silas Thorn was at the front of the pack, his hands outstretched, his smile wide and hungry. "Pilot Vance, Colonel Valtaris, the saviors of the Opaline Nebula. The Union owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid, but we shall certainly try. We've already drafted the plans for a new research wing, the Vance Taris Initiative, for non-psychic defensive systems." Kaelen looked around the hangar. He saw the faces of the people he had saved. He saw the young soldiers, the tired mechanics, the wounded he had hauled out of the fire. They were happy. They were alive. But then he looked at Thorne, and he realized that the administrator was already moving on to the next war. He felt a hand on his arm. It was Dr. Alara. She looked exhausted, her lab coat still stained with the residue of the Aegis reset. She leaned in close, her voice a whisper beneath the roar of the crowd. "They're already drafting the requisition orders for your ship, Kaelen," she said. "They want to strip the snail down to the frame, and they've put a lock on Vexra's service record. They're not going to let her retire. Not now. Not after what she did." Kaelen felt a cold, hard knot of resolve form in his chest. He looked at Vexra, who was standing beside him, her expression a mask of regal indifference that he knew was hiding a breaking heart. "Barnaby," Kaelen whispered into his collarcom. "I am here, Kaelen. Although I am currently being scanned by 3 different military diagnostics teams, they find my programming quaint. Can you still access the station's logistics network? I have never left it, Kaelen. It is quite poorly defended. They spend all their money on psychic firewalls and forget that someone could just walk in through the shipping manifest. I need you to do something for me," Kaelen said, stepping forward to meet Thorne's handshake. "I need you to find 2 retirement files, one for a logistics pilot with too many accidents, and one for an Athelian colonel who has done enough killing for 3 lifetimes." "And then?" Barnaby asked. "And then," Kaelen said, shaking Thorne's hand while looking him straight in the eye, "I need you to make us disappear." The next few hours were a blur of flashbulbs and empty speeches. Kaelen was ushered into a VIP suite that was larger than his entire ship. There was champagne, there were medals on velvet pillows, and there was a tailor waiting to measure him for a formal uniform he never intended to wear. Vexra was taken to a separate briefing room, supposedly for a medical checkup, but Kaelen knew it was an interrogation masquerading as care. He sat on the edge of a silk-covered bed, looking at the medal Thorne had pinned to his tattered jacket. It was gold, shaped like a rising sun. "It's heavy," a voice said from the doorway. Kaelen looked up. Jackson was standing there. He wasn't wearing his flight suit. He was in a simple duty uniform, and he looked older. "I didn't come to congratulate you," Jackson said, walking into the room. "I came to tell you that I'm resigning my commission." Kaelen blinked. "Why?" "You're the poster boy for the Vanguard. You're going to be an admiral in 5 years." Jackson shook his head, looking out the window at the stars. "I watched you out there, Vance. I watched a guy who shouldn't have been there do everything right because he actually cared about the people in the crates. I've spent my whole life being useful. I've been a weapon, a symbol, a scorecard. But when the Prime hit us with that scream, I realized I didn't have anything else. No soil, no roots, just a fast ship and a lot of arrogance." He turned to Kaelen, his expression solemn. "I'm going back to the inner colonies. My family has a ranch on Ceres. It's quiet, it's dusty, and nobody gives a damn about kill counts. I think I want to try being ordinary for a while." Kaelen felt a surge of respect for the man he had once despised. "It's harder than it looks, Jackson. Being ordinary takes a lot of work." "I'm willing to put in the hours," Jackson said. He reached out and shook Kaelen's hand. This time there were no threats, no ego, just 2 men who had seen the void and survived. "Good luck, Kaelen. I have a feeling Thorne is going to find you a very difficult asset to manage." "You have no idea," Kaelen said with a grin. As Jackson left, the door hissed open again. Vexra stepped inside. She looked pale, but her eyes were bright with a fierce, cold fire. "They want to move me to a classified facility on Earth," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "They want to hone the resonance. They think they can use it to strike the Void Strider homeworld." Kaelen stood up and walked to her, taking her hands in his. "They can only use us if we stay here, Vexra. They can only turn us into weapons if we keep playing the part." "What are we going to do?" she asked. Kaelen looked at the medal on the bed. "We're going to do what I do best. We're going to mess up the paperwork. We're going to deliver a cargo that was never supposed to leave the station, ourselves." "Barnaby," Kaelen said, his voice low and urgent. "Is it done?" "The files have been updated, Kaelen," the computer replied. "As of 3 minutes ago, pilot Kaelen Vance and Colonel Vexra Valteris have been officially listed as missing in action, presumed deceased, due to delayed hull failure of the Aurora Cargo 17. I have also taken the liberty of transferring 200,000 credits of unclaimed logistics surpluses to a blind account on the independent rim. It was remarkably easy. Your military has a very poor habit of rounding down their decimals. Vexra looked at Kaelen, a look of shocked hope dawning on her face. We're dead? To the Union, yes, Kaelen said. But the rusty snail is currently being prepped for automated disposal in Hangar 42. The guards think she's being sent to the scrap heap. Ilara helped me with the clearance codes. Kaelen, Vexra whispered, a smile finally breaking across her face. You are a terrible, wonderful man. I'm a freighter pilot, Vexra, Kaelen said, grabbing his old grease-stained jacket and leaving the gold medal on the bed. I'm just delivering some very important cargo to a place where the flutes are always playing. They moved through the station like shadows, avoiding the main corridors and the celebrating crowds. They used the maintenance ducts, the laundry chutes, and the service lifts that smelled of floor wax and old oil. To the thousands of people cheering their names in the grand halls, they were legends. To the station's automated sensors, they were just two more bodies moving through the background noise of the bastion. When they reached Hangar 42, the rusty snail was waiting for them. She looked terrible. Her hull was scorched, her thrusters were dented, and she was currently attached to a massive magnetic disposal crane. But to Kaelen, she was the most beautiful thing in the galaxy. They boarded the ship, the airlock hissing shut behind them. The interior was dark, save for the soft green glow of the bridge. Welcome home, Barnaby said, his voice sounding perfectly clear for the first time in hours. I have taken the liberty of preloading a flight path through the Opaline Nebula's back channels. It is dangerous, unpredictable, and entirely unmonitored. I believe you will find it quite charming. Kaelen sat in the pilot's seat and felt the familiar vibration of the deck beneath his boots. He looked at the manual levers, the copper wire bypasses, and the bobblehead stegosaurus. You ready? He asked Vexra. She sat in the co-pilot's chair and reached for the manual thruster control. I've been ready for 80 years, Kaelen. The rusty snail detached from the crane and drifted out into the darkness. There was no fanfare, no cheering, and no medals. Just a slow, battered freighter slipping away into the stars, carrying the only two people in the galaxy who knew that the greatest victory wasn't winning the war, but finding a way to stop fighting it. 3 months had passed since the rusty snail had officially ceased to exist. In that time, the galaxy had continued its frantic, noisy spin. The Union had celebrated its victory over the Void Striders, Silas Thorne had been promoted to a high ministry position, and the Vance Terrace Initiative had become a multi-billion credit program that produced a lot of expensive hardware and very few results. But out on the edge of the independent rim, on a small, nameless moon orbiting a sleepy orange giant, none of that mattered. The moon, which Kaelen had taken to calling the Garden, was a world of pale blue grass and trees that looked like giant, glowing feathers. The air was thick and sweet, and the only noise was the rhythmic sighing of the wind through the crystal canyons. Kaelen Vance stood on the lowered cargo ramp of the snail, which was now serving as the porch of their makeshift home. He was wearing a pair of faded work trousers and a linen shirt that smelled of the local soil. He was currently elbow-deep in the ship's primary reactor core, which he had finally moved out of the hull and into a small stone shed near a freshwater stream. It's still leaking, Barnaby, Kaelen muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his nose with his shoulder. The leak is a feature, Kaelen, the computer replied from a portable terminal perched on a nearby rock. It provides a gentle warmth to the local moss. I have calculated that the moss is currently 17% happier because of your inability to tighten a bolt properly. Kaelen chuckled. He picked up a heavy wrench, the same one he had thrown at the Void Strider scout pod, and gave the primary valve a firm, satisfying turn. The leaking stopped with a quiet hiss. He stepped back and looked at the reactor. It was a patchwork of Union tech, ethylene crystals, and bits of scrap metal he'd found in the moon's caves. It was ugly, it was inefficient, and it was perfect. It powered their lights, their water pump, and the small holographic projector they used to watch the stars at night. Kaelen! He looked up to see Vexra walking toward him across the field of blue grass. She was wearing a simple, flowing dress of local silk, her silver hair loose and blowing in the wind. She was carrying a basket filled with glowing purple fruits that looked like lanterns. She looked different. The tightness in her shoulders was gone. Her ears were no longer twitching with the stress of 1,000 distant psychic screams. They were relaxed, occasionally angling toward the sound of a nearby bird call. "The harvest is good," she said, stopping beside him and offering him a piece of fruit. "The trees in the South Canyon are finally blooming. They smell like peace." Kaelen took a bite of the fruit. It was sweet, cold, and tasted of nothing he had ever known in the colonies. "Better than a nutritional cube?" Vexra laughed, the sound clear and bright as the crystal canyons. "A nutritional cube is a crime against existence, Kaelen. I still wake up at night worried that a gray square is going to fall from the ceiling." They sat together on the cargo ramp, watching the orange sun begin to dip behind the feathery trees. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had found the resonance they had been looking for, not a frequency of war or power, but the quiet, steady vibration of two souls who had finally found their place in the dirt. Kaelen leaned back, his head resting against the warm metal of the ship. He looked at his hands. They were still stained with grease, but they were no longer shaking. "You know," he said softly, "I spent my whole life thinking I was the guy who didn't fit. I thought being soft was a defect in a universe that only valued hardness. I thought my only job was to stay out of the way and keep the boxes moving." Vexra leaned her head on his shoulder, her cool skin a familiar comfort. "And now I think that the boxes were just practice," Kaelen said. "I think the universe is full of people trying to be stars, trying to burn so bright that everyone has to look at them. But stars are lonely, Vexra, and when they run out of fuel, they leave a hole in the sky. I'd rather be the dirt. I'd rather be the guy who grows things. I'd rather be the person who picks up the broken pieces and finds a way to make them hum again." He looked at the rusty snail, which was currently covered in climbing vines and glowing moss. She wasn't a ship anymore. She was a foundation. "I used to be afraid of being noticed," Kaelen continued. "I thought attention was a target, but I realized that the only reason I was afraid was because I didn't know what I was standing for. Once I decided that I stood for you, and for the people who couldn't fight for themselves, the fear didn't go away. It just changed. It became a reason to stay." Vexra reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "You stayed for me when the entire galaxy was telling you to run. You chose the soft path in a hard world, and because you did, I am no longer a weapon. I am just Vexra, and that is more than I ever dreamed I could be." The sun disappeared, and the first of the moon's 3 moons began to rise, casting a soft silver light over the garden. Kaelen looked out at the horizon, at the infinite reach of space where he had spent so many years feeling small. He didn't feel small anymore. He felt rooted. He stood up, pulling Vexra with him. "Come on, Barnaby has been threatening to play that new symphony he's been composing using the sounds of the wind canyons. He says it's a masterpiece." "Is it better than the flutes?" Vexra asked, her eyes twinkling. "Objectively, yes," Barnaby's voice chimed from the terminal, "although I have included a small flute solo in the 3rd movement as a tribute to Kaelen's unique tactical heritage." They walked toward the small stone house, their shadows long and joined on the blue grass. As they reached the door, Kaelen stopped and looked back one last time at the snail. He thought about the journey, from the bloody hangar of the Aurora to the white-hot eye of the Aegis. He thought about Jackson on his ranch, and Alara in her lab, and the thousands of soldiers who were breathing because a freighter pilot had accidentally hit the wrong button. Life wasn't a mission to be completed. It wasn't a cargo to be delivered. It was the resonance of the moments in between, the quiet breakfast, the difficult repair, the hand held in the dark. It was the choice to be human in a universe that often demanded something less. "I spent 32 years trying to be invisible. I thought that if I could just keep my head down and my paperwork in order, the universe would forget I was here, and I'd be safe. I treated my life like a flight path with no obstacles, always looking for the smoothest air and the shortest route. But standing here on this moon, with the dirt of a new world under my fingernails and the weight of a legendary pilot's hand in mine, I realize how wrong I was. Safety isn't the absence of danger. It's the presence of something worth fighting for. I used to think my softness was a crack in the hull, a weakness that would eventually let the vacuum in. But it was that very softness that allowed me to feel the resonance of the people around me. It was my refusal to be a weapon that made me a shield. We're all just battered freighters, I think. We've all got patches on our hulls, stuttering fuel pumps, and cargo we're too afraid to open. We spend our lives trying to look like sleek interceptors, fast and untouchable, because we're terrified that if people see the rust, they'll think we're scrap. But the rust is where the stories are. The patches are where we've proven we can survive. And the cargo? The cargo is the love we carry for the people who decide to fly beside us, even when our engines are screaming and the stars are going dark. I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who stayed. And in the end, that's the only thing that ever really mattered. I look out at the stars sometimes and I wonder about the people still back there, still trying to prove they are the brightest light in the nebula. I wonder if they're tired of the noise. I wonder if they're tired of being useful. So I have to ask you, sitting there in your own corner of the galaxy, we spend so much of our time trying to be the best, the strongest, the most useful version of ourselves for a world that always wants more. But when the alarms finally stop and the screens go dark, who is the person left in the seat? Are you happy with that person, even if they're a little bit broken, a little bit slow, and a whole lot of ordinary? Because I've learned that the most courageous thing you can ever do isn't conquering a galaxy. It's finally giving yourself permission to just be you. Kaelen squeezed Vexra's hand one last time before stepping inside, the soft, resonant chords of Barnaby's Wind Symphony beginning to drift through the open door. On the dashboard of the rusty snail, the little Stegosaurus bobblehead gave a slow, rhythmic nod in the evening breeze. The flutes were finally silent, and for the first time everything was exactly as it should be,